Suicide rates reach all-time high in the US per CDC data. Suicide rates have reached an all-time high in the US, according to new data posted on Friday from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Approximately 49,500 people died by suicide in 2022, a 2.6% increase over the prior year and the highest number on record. Suicides have risen steadily in the country over the past 2 decades, per the National Center for Health Statistics. In 2000, some 29,350 people took their own lives. A decade later, that number had risen to 38,364, and it reached 48,344 in 2018. There was a short-lived decline of suicides in 2020 when they dipped to 45,979 during the first year of the pandemic, but they began rising again in 2021. We've seen these increases for many, many years, CDC Chief Medical Officer Dr. Deborah Hourly told Mark Sagel, Fox News medical contributor, during a radio interview on Thursday, August 10th. There was a slight decline in 2019 and 2020, but over the past 15 years, we've been on this trajectory. Many experts, including Dr. Rehan Aziz, a psychiatrist at Jersey Shore University Medical Center in Neptune, New Jersey, believe that the pandemic played a role in the suicide spike post-2020. During the pandemic, social isolation increased and access to mental health services decreased, he told Fox News Digital. The COVID virus itself is also associated with high rates of depression, anxiety, and brain fog, he went on. All of these factors could have contributed to higher rates of completed suicide in the post-pandemic era. Numerous factors may be driving up the suicide rate, experts say, including depression and scarcity of mental health providers, as reported by the Associated Press. So we'll leave it there for now. But my initial thoughts on this article, unfortunately, I was not surprised. I think we live in an ever-increasing dark culture, and sadly, this is something that we are seeing become a common trend, that suicide rates are up, depression is up, and I think the lockdowns and all of the COVID fiasco really did a number on individuals' mental health. I think what it really did was expose a lot of issues that were probably already there in our system, and it just exacerbated the issue, and we're beginning to see the fruit of that play out. It's incredibly unfortunate, and we're going to have to talk a lot about this, and this could be its own podcast. We could really do a deep dive here. We won't be able to tackle all the angles on this story tonight, but Adam, I'll turn it over to you first to get your initial reaction to the article.
Doesn't surprise me at all. You know, during the pandemic, I was thinking about prison. You know, what do they do to you in prison when you cause a lot of trouble? Your punishment is isolation, right? And what do they determine? That isolation is actually torture. It's torture to the human being. We're social creatures. And when you create a society that is scared to either go outside, or you punish them by making them isolate away from everybody else, you make a sicker world. And that's what we're seeing. And I think, I mean, I don't know the statistics, but I would imagine suicide rates for adolescents probably increase as well, especially with them not being able to go to school for an extended period of time. You know, not to say too much, but my son was having issues as well with his mental health. You know, so it's just, it really doesn't surprise me, but it's very sad that no one considered this as a possibility. Everybody was just looking at the now. It didn't care about the possible ramifications of just the emotional, we need to do something right now. Mm-hmm. And no one wanted to pump the brakes. No one wanted to consider any possible negative outcomes coming from it.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, Todd, you've been very vocal on COVID and lockdowns and just the effect that it's had on our society. So I'd love to get your reaction, as well as feel free to respond to anything Adam just said there.
Well, isolation is a key term, but they didn't necessarily isolate us. This happened because of how isolated we already were. We are so individualistic, living in our own bubbles, that we were primed for this. When we're outside of the church, but even inside of the church, let's face it, I know there are a lot of great churches out there that ended up drawing a line in the sand. But for the most part, if you looked around you, the churches were behaving just like everybody else. Just get in line, do as you're told, drink the Kool-Aid. It was really appalling. The Holy Spirit has been nowhere on this. Listen, our hope is ultimately, we don't believe in cheap grace. Hope is supposed to be able to overcome this. A virus with a 99 point whatever survival rate, and we were like, running for the hills like it was the Day of the Dead. We were already isolated in mind, body, and soul. We really found out that we really, as a people, believe in nothing other than fear, comfort, just the id. Our buttons are so easily pushed. And that's why, listen, I believe on some level COVID was a purposeful manipulation of us. But even if it was purely accidental, we were a people in this time that was ripe to be picked off because of how we live our lives normally. We are utterly, whether it's our phones or how sedentary we've become, how unhealthy we've become in so many different ways. We're not meant as a people to be so individualistic. Which doesn't mean individualism in and of itself is a terrible thing. It's done a lot of wonderful things for this nation. But now we become gods unto ourselves. And when that ultimately is outside of God, is destined to lead to that isolation, that loneliness, that despair that leads to offing oneself. It was inevitable.
There's a distinction that comes to mind for me in how people responded to COVID. Because, around, let's say, February, March, April, May of 2020, most of us were reasonably concerned because we didn't know what was going on. There was a healthy dose of, we should probably distance, maybe stay in from going to big public events or whatever. And there was a reasonable immediacy to the response. But what is most telling, I think, is after that, what you're saying, Todd, of whether people stood for something they believed in once the data was coming out on the mortality rates or on who it was that was being infected, or even longer after than that, the efficacy of the vaccinations. There are people who still to this day live in fear and where they wear their masks, they don't go into social settings because they've become so trained in that. And it reminds me of I think a paradigm that I've discussed before on this podcast, and that is the difference in thought of how liberals versus conservatives would approach any given situation. A conservative approach most often looks at the long-term game and thinks, how can this be benefiting us in generations to come, in long-term solutions? And a more liberal mindset tends to be an immediate emotional response of, this is the problem right now. So at a certain point during COVID lockdowns, I think there are more and more people saying, our kids aren't going to school. They're not socializing properly. They're having unhealthy relationships with people through digital mediums. And this shouldn't continue the way that it is. And then the more immediate response was, people are still dying, and if you go out, you're going to kill your grandma. Well, now on the other side of it, we can kind of do an autopsy and say, what the heck? Why did so overwhelming of a majority of the population conform to prolonged masking, prolonged work from home situations, schooling from home situations? And now we're seeing the result of that is the suicide rates going higher and higher and higher. And the article that we're discussing focuses on COVID as a reason for that. But what's fascinating in the midst of that article, it blames scarcity of mental health providers, which is really baffling to me because I feel as if in my career and in my experience, there is a surplus of mental health providers more so than I've ever known of in any other generation. So I want to know, what do you guys think of that? Do we need more mental health providers, or do we need fewer mental health issues?
Maybe it's regional. Maybe there are certain areas of the country that there aren't as many therapists. It's possible. I live in New Jersey, so I'm more skewed. It's very populated here. You can always find something. But maybe there's parts of the country that don't have it. Just like any other resource, there's probably some area that has some sort of scarcity to it. But yeah, I don't know if that's really the thing. That article just sounds like it's just covering all its bases.
Yeah, it did. It gave me that same impression. Something that Todd said earlier, he was talking about the overemphasis on individualism. I would say that there's a lot of individuals who are probably they've been to counseling maybe too many times. There's almost an overemphasis on mental health because of that individualism. Everyone kind of wants to. Sometimes it's playing a victim. Sometimes it's honestly just individuals need to learn how to take the conflicts that life throws at you and just learn how to live with them and learn how to adapt to them. And there is an overemphasis in especially the millennial and Gen Z generation of being really okay with going to counseling. And that's been a net positive in some ways, because you could argue that past generations, refused to seek help to a fault. But now I think a lot of our generation and younger is starting to really take counseling so seriously that everyone has an issue, that everyone has trauma about every little thing. And it really boils down to that overemphasis on individualism. It's like everyone wants to be unique with their 3 or 4 or 5, pet ailments that they carry around. I mean, at least that's just the way I see it. Obviously there's room for debate on that front, but that's where my mind goes. Maybe I'm off on that.
Well, victimization has become an entire worldview. I mean, look, you have D1 athletes now with being told that they have been victims of the system for generations. Listen, I happen to have a D1 athlete. She's spoiled rotten at school, and she doesn't get a penny from name, image, and likeness or anything like that. But we've condition people that you're not authentically living yourself if you believe. And people are that really victimized in this world by terrible things. We really don't need people who are told you get to have a scholarship and go to college, that you are fundamentally shackled in your life. That's just absolute nonsense. And then when it comes to COVID, this isn't the victimization mindset is that we really got away with this thing. We got lucky. Thank God that vaccine came in time. I don't know. You guys go to church, the people you talk to, do they really believe that we were on death's door? Do they still believe that vaccine saved all of us? And this ties directly into this level of despair, because the devil is ultimately the father of what? He's the father of lies. And if we're still, as a culture, believing that we just narrowly escaped, if we're preaching that, and yet people are still killing themselves at the rate this data shows it. So it seems like the saving grace of the magical vaccine, and you've heard me talk about that on the show, isn't quite connecting. I think people realize through all of this that our faith teaches us that the better angels of our natures can rise above this and all things, and the worst of us instead came out in this thing. And it's intuitive in people, even the worst people, the people right now that you are trying to tear down the church. On some level, they're acting out because they understand this is garbage. This is nonsense. None of this connects. We should have been able to come together. Listen, why does the church the church, for the most part, look exactly like the world when it came to COVID.
Hmm.
There's zero good answers to that.
Yeah.
What did we really all now? Maybe hopefully you guys. I mean, maybe you guys ended up at a church that was the answer to that darkness. But listen, again, speaking as a Catholic, for the most part, the Catholic Church just said, just do what you're told. Let's get through this. That's not a light in the darkness.
Hmm.
That's not
Well,
that's goats.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is I really feel like a lot of this is a fault of just an under catechized population within our churches. And it's funny because you're Catholic, Todd. Michael and I are Protestant, so I'm sure we have our theological disagreements. And ultimately, I think right now we've got bigger fish to fry. And we can always have a fun conversation about those differences later. But something that the Catholic Church historically has been much better on than Protestant churches is catechizing. And when you know your catechism properly and you have basic answers to some of life's hardest questions, I mean, you know what the meaning of life is. You can literally answer that in 2 sentences when you're properly catechized. And so many people don't actually have proper meaning in their life that the fear of death was just so crippling. And that included people in the church. And I think as a result, we see these people within the church that were so fearful. And ultimately, I think so many pastors did not want to speak out on being more bold during the lockdowns, especially because, like Michael said, there's definitely, I think everyone gets a grace period in the early stages of not knowing what it was. But once the data started coming in, I think there was too many churches that were still shuttered because too many of the congregants were so fearful that many of the pastors listened to the congregants and kept their doors shut. And of course, I'm sure there's pastors individually that were very terrified as well. But I can say I went to a church that kind of played somewhere in the middle. They started reopening when they could, bit by bit. I'm no longer at that church. That's in a whole other state. That's a whole thing in itself. But either way, ultimately, I think that the fear drove people in the pulpit and in the congregation to ultimately shut their doors when there was no longer a reason to. And so many individuals, as we see, were clearly needing help in this time frame as we see depression start to rise. And I mean, it said that in 2020 there was a brief dip in the suicide rate, but it did show that starting at the beginning of the pandemic is when we started seeing the rates of substance abuse and domestic abuse start to go up. So it might have taken a moment for some of the cows to come home, but ultimately we're just seeing the fruit of what I would really say was brought on by the lockdowns. But again, I think there was issues in our society, like Adam mentioned, the isolation. I think people are isolated long before lockdowns. Lockdowns just made it worse. We live in our own bubbles on social media, and we've lost a lot of that human connection, and we've lost a lot of that spiritual connection. And I think that's really driving people mad.
Well, it's like we started this conversation, exactly what you're saying. I don't think that the mental health crisis has really anything to do with COVID itself. COVID just turned up the heat. And the isolation that Adam was talking about is very present. I think like he was talking about punishment in prison. There was a lot of people who felt imprisoned in their homes when they were living in fear of going out of their homes, and students that were experiencing school like this through a screen. And that's not the social interactions that any young person needs to thrive. So it's going to breed antisocial behavior. And ultimately, the suicide thing, I think it's important to identify where the issue lies and how it applies to our larger culture. Usually suicide comes up in the context of the whole trans conversation. And if you oppress trans kids and don't affirm them, then they're just going to go kill themselves. That's kind of the narrative that's being put out there. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a fundamental issue there, obviously, and we would all recognize that they're saying suicide in trans children or trans adolescents, teenage, whatever, any sort of person struggling with sexual dysphoria. I think what the narrative says is that if you're not nice to them and affirming of them, that's going to cause their suicide. But I think we would maybe argue that their issue with mental health stability and their image issue of how they identify themselves, where they find value, where they find purpose, they overemphasize the individualism that Todd is talking about in this culture where we need to define ourselves, make our own self, our own God, really. I think it's a form of idolatry. And when we engage in constant idolatry, it will demand sacrifices. And to an extent, I think it'd be good to recognize that a lot of the mental health issues that are in place here have to do with the stability of people's spirituality and how they relate to others through their spirituality, how they relate to themselves, and how they prioritize their image of themselves. And those of us who are found in Christ identify ourselves in the image of Christ, who is self sacrificing, who is loving and gracious, and able to endure great hardship as well.
Amen. We're doing a great disservice to people if we keep telling them that their pain is unique and special. That's a prison. If whatever's hurting you is something that no one else can possibly understand, no wonder you feel you can't escape it. No, my pain has been experienced by thousands of others before. Perhaps the three brothers right before me right now. And that's where we can get out of it. It's been done before. Somebody broke these chains before. And of course, so there's the fellowship amongst mere mortals like us, and then there's the fellowship we have with the Savior, as you just mentioned. But it is an utter disaster if we start lying to ourselves and saying that whatever our unique pain is, nobody else can understand. My pain is what makes me special. Your pain doesn't make you remotely special. And that's what we need to escape out of. And that's what so many kids these days fall into. They get their identity through victimization. You can't go anywhere. Honestly, it is a straight path to suicide if that's what you ultimately believe sooner or later.
Yeah.
It's a hard pill to swallow. And I know Connor and I were raised in a generation where, largely speaking, the educators and influencers in our life growing up, and we were told that you are special, that you are unique, and nobody can feel your feelings except for you, and everything about you is unique and special, and you're a winner, and everyone gets a trophy. And now those people are raising children with that same understanding, and we're seeing the negative results of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Adam, I wanted to turn it to you for the last word on this story, because you've talked a lot about victimhood. You've talked a lot about the culture of victimhood. So how do you think that ties in? Because obviously there's a genuine problem here with these suicide rates being high, but we've also outlined a lot of other problems of everyone maybe overemphasizing their own problems to a point where there's an they're giving too much attention to their problems, which may be driving some of these mental health ideas. But you talked a lot about victimhood, so I'd love to kind of hear more of your thoughts on that area.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I want to kind of bring up is that I talk about my mental health issues publicly because I think often, like Todd was saying, we all think that no one else is going through it or no one else has experienced it. So I think talking about it openly and publicly can encourage people to seek help, or at least understand they're not alone in this fight. And so if someone is able to overcome it, who's going through the same obstacle, then it's likely for them to be able to overcome it as well. So I think that's a very important message that needs to happen. In regards to victimhood, I treat it much of the same way. I talk about me experiencing victimhood, going through depression. When you have deep depression, you victimize yourself, and you stay within this mentality that's overtly negative. And overcoming that obstacle is something that I'm very proud of, and something that I want to talk about, because now I see it within a whole bunch of different people. And some people go in and out of victimhood, some people stay within victimhood, but ultimately victimhood produces nothing of greatness. It is something that only holds you down. And part of our issue right now is that our environment is rewarding victimhood. It's having people discover victimhood even when they're not victims of anything, right? They're just manufacturing their own oppression. And it's kind of like, stabbing yourself and celebrating how many wounds you have. So I think the victimhood narrative, you can quite literally see it in everything. In my book, I talk about it somewhat from a racial standpoint, but you can swap race out with just about anything. It's the same mentality. It's the same struggle. But it's also the same thing that people of all walks of life can overcome.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I wanted to jump into the chat real quick before we move on to our next story. I saw on Rumble, Hidden Angel said that he needs to move to a smaller town. Definitely do that. It's well worth it. Get out of the cities. And Michaela on YouTube said, Satan already tells people they are alone in their suffering. The beauty of the gospel is that Christ is the one that suffered for us and now walks with us through our hardships.
Hidden Angels also said earlier in the chat on Rumble that their church is still thinking that COVID's the end of the world, and that they live in a college town in North Carolina, and that might have to do with why that could be.
Probably very well does.
If I may,
Yeah.
I love what Adam just said. I mean, he's standing on the shoulders of giants there, with whether it's Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington. Again, I mean, these guys really had people who wanted them not to succeed and may well not have even wanted them to live. They were real victims of really bad things, but they had the same answer that Adam just gave about, like, I can't let myself just be the victim. And they did. They conquered. We all know we can choose to teach our children, white or black, about them if we want to, or we can continue to teach them nonsense about whatever the victim is, white or black. See, I just think Adam just nailed it on the head. Just as many generations before us, going back and back and back. We always have a choice of what we want our narrative to be.
Exactly.
Amen.
It's interesting, and Adam, I've heard you talk about this before on another podcast, is it's not limited to a liberal victimhood, but that there's conservative victimhood as well.
Absolutely.
And it's very much a
Yes.
universal experience that it's almost like comfort food.
Yes.
Comfort food makes it fat and unhealthy, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah. I mean, do you want an example?
yes, please.
So, a conservative victimhood narrative, I say conservative / Republican, however you want to see it.
Yeah.
Well, and this is not to say whether it's right or wrong, but I'm just saying how it comes through and how I hear it. It is Trump lost the election. Okay. So then the next remark is, well, it was stolen from him. And then I hear, well, what's the point anyways? Right?
Black pill.
So yeah, it's overtly negative. It's like, look what they're doing to us. They're taking from us. They're stealing from us. And I'm thinking to myself, well, so you mean to tell me there's nothing that Trump could have done that would have been better, that would have increased his odds of winning? There's nothing that could have possibly done. There's no other possibility for him to win, right? And so the victim mindset says there is nothing that could have been done. Losing was always going to happen. It's someone else's fault, right? And I'm trying to say, not as someone who hates Trump, but as someone who says everyone should take accountability for their actions, whether they win or lose. And so when I say, okay, let's say if certain ballot things happen in certain places, but you're telling me there's zero that Trump could have done, right? And an honest person would be like, well, he could have done this better. He could have done that better, right? They would examine it. But a person who stays within that victim mindset will say there is zero that could have been done. Or if I point out something and said that part doesn't even matter because the stolen votes are, so they will always hone in on the negative.
Yeah.
And I think the remedy for victimhood is accountability. It's being responsible for your outcomes. The problem that I see, whether in politics really, is avoiding that, just outwardly avoiding that. And if you try to hold anyone accountable, then you are chastised for it, or you are only saying that because you're part of this, and right. And I think that's a really, really big problem, because if you care about someone, if you care about something, you will criticize it. right? If
Yeah.
you see your child messing up,
Preach.
you wouldn't say, well,
Preach.
it's okay. No, you say, hey, you're messing up. Here's where you're messing up. Here's how you can fix it so you can do better. But what we're telling people is that in politics, the person that you like is perfect, and there's nothing that they can do.
Mhm.
And if that perfect person doesn't reach that outcome that you believe that they should reach, it's because someone did that to them. Someone took it away from them, right? And it's poisonous, it's unhealthy, and it results in the status quo. So I fear that we're going to see well, we might talk about this later, but I fear we might see the same patterns happen again and again in the next couple of years. So
Oh, you will. Oh, you will.
Yeah.